in thanking you for your time today as you are here and you've made a commitment to take on what is arguably the most significant work on this campus this year. I know so many of you personally, and I know that you are people who care about what happens in your classrooms, your laboratories, your shops. You care about the outcomes of the student. You want your students to go on the path that they've chosen, whether that's directly into the workplace or onto transfer. We all want our students to be able to use their time at Triton College effectively enough so that it changes their lives. I would be willing to bet that there isn't a single person in this room who doesn't know in his or her own heart that they have changed the lives of their students. The job that we all have is so meaningful and significant, and then you agreeing to take part in this work, to me it shows your dedication. It shows me that you have tremendous pride in your work, which I already knew anyway. But this is how we can demonstrate that to the Higher Learning Commission, because they don't know how awesome we are yet, and they don't understand the power of the faculty. I do. And all through this process with Lauren, being supported by Pamela Perry, I'm there with them, and my job is to get them the resources that they need. I'm there to make sure that they have what they want to have, that we're sending a positive message back to the faculty, because we're providing you the work time and the work structure that you need to help you get through this very challenging work. I commend you. Again, I'm not surprised by this. I knew that we would find a way between us to get to this place. Could have been easier, but things are rarely easy here. And we're going to just move on. And those of you who know me a little more personally know that I almost always get what I want. And here today, I got what I wanted. So thank you very much for doing that. I'm also here to introduce Joe Levy. How many people here know Kiana? She's my assistant in the A building. I think she went back. She gave me Joe Levy's bio on literally the smallest font she could find. And I guess she forgot my age. I'm going to try it. Joe Levy serves as the Executive Director of Assessment and Accreditation at National Louis University in Chicago. He's currently working on his doctorate at NIU. His research interests include promoting data-informed decision-making and use across campus. He's a member of the Student Affairs Open course, and he serves as a coach for the National Institute of Learning Outcomes Assessment. Joe is published with multiple journals and presented for several organizations and conferences. Having worked in academic and student affairs at multiple institutions, as well as being an assessment consultant outside of that. He's always happy to talk assessment practices and strategy. So we'll see about that. So we'll see if you still think that at the end of this day. I think you will. Thanks to everyone who's here. I hope you have a good day and hope you move your needle a little bit. Thank you.
All right, so I'll hold the mic to try and control my hands since I'm a big hand talker. But hello.
Hello.
I'm very excited to be here. I love talking about assessments. I'll give you a little bit of information about me, and then I want to at least quickly hear names and your areas of concentration from you all. But this is me. So quick rundown of my history. I, as an undergraduate, majored in English, minored in mathematics. Would have kept with the double major, but I knew I wanted to go into higher education and started snacking my time towards preparation with that. I got my graduate degree in student affairs and higher education, and that's really where I started doing a lot of my assessment work, and I became a program evaluator at a community college. I also then went on to work as an assessment consultant with an educational technology company. While I was there, I consulted for about 50 institutions for about 2.5 years, working with them the entire time, so really watching their culture grow. And then on and off, consulted with about 50 other institutions just on isolated projects. So what I really like about that part of my experience and my career is that I got to see assessment play out at over 100 different institutions. So I've seen the struggles, the common pitfalls, as well as the successes that people have had. And it's doable, and it's achievable, and it can be enjoyable as well. But it was a great proving ground for me, and then I went on from there to work at a number of different institutions. Probably one of the big exposure for me into accreditation that then launched that part of my career was I worked as the director of assessment at an institution that I took the job knowing they were put on notice by HLC for assessment work, and I was charged by the provost. They told me when they hired me, like, your job is to get us off notice. And I did. I've been in the position of working at an institution having to intentionally work with faculty and staff to change the culture and move forward and better the institution, but not in a top-down, you're going to do it this way approach, but really in a collaborative way that was meaningful and mattered to the faculty and staff. And yeah, now I serve at NLU in my role, and then I work with the Student Affairs Assessment Leader Group, and also serve as a coach for NILOA. So while I'm working with you all, I was telling Lauren even I'm going to another school in a couple weeks on behalf of NILOA to do great work, again, on learning outcome assessment. I'm always happy to do it because I love this stuff, and I love tapping into learning and tapping into the passion that you all have in your roles and helping show that whether you believe it or not, you have some experience in assessments and you're doing some of this work already. And so it's just a matter sometimes of putting that into a certain format or gathering some more documentation and formalization around it. I think it's important to also talk about me as a person so that I'm not just this assessment talking head up here. I'm a new dad. I have a toddler who just is about to turn 2. She is certainly keeping me, as if work in a doctorate program weren't enough. She keeps me very busy at home. But yeah, and I have very eclectic interests. I am a competitive eater. I have choreographed dances and performed. I'm a playwright. I produce plays. So I have a wide variety of interests. And I share that not to brag about myself, but to show that all the different disciplines can and do apply to assessment. So I'm working with my campus right now of our written communication program, and the faculty sometimes they're telling me, well, we don't think this way. This doesn't make sense to us. I said, well, I can help it make sense to you because I was an English major. This can make sense. So that's me. Before I talk about the agenda, I wanted to get just name and your discipline from the folks here. You don't have to stand up if you don't want to, just shout so I can hear you.
Mr. Christopher?
So Christopher Clem, hospitality, I teach culinary arts.
I'm Beth Dunn, I teach math.
Matt C, Spanish, social science.
Francis Big, architecture.
Patty Shields, continuing education.
Ed Kuipers, architecture and construction technology.
Maybe you first.
Seth McClellan, mass communication.
Dennis McNamara, art.
Kathy Durzinski, health, sport, exercise science.
Gabe Guzman, I'm chair of science.
Joe Boyko, biology.
Julian Murphy, exercise science.
Annie Nagel, chemistry. Susan Brody, biotechnology.
Deb Kurkowski, ultrasound.
Pam Harmon, radiology. Lisa Lux, ophthalmology.
TJ, surgical tech and sterile processing.
Lori Malloy, nuclear medicine.
John Cody, medical assistant.
Victoria Hackerham, English. Laura Schumar, history.
Eugene Mohammed, philosophy.
Victor McComb, sociology.
Holland, psychology.
Bill Decker, political science.
Denise Smith, Devery, hospitality.
Brenda Portable, fire and EMS.
Danny Reed, culinary arts.
Ken Benson, horticulture.
Rick Peter, justice.
And Signy Sherris, engineering technology.
Ken Davis, automotive.
Steve Sikora, automotive.
Robert Cummings, automotive.
Robin Phillips,
Gretchen Reyes, business management. Angela Stone, education. Kathy DeVilio, visual communications.
Allie Miller, early childhood education. Isabel Miller, behavioral science.
Mike Mason, computer information systems.
And the folks not at the table.
Paul Nicholson, astronomy and physics.
Joel Potter, communications and institution.
Campbell, student health course.
Centers Memorial Faculty Development.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to tell you right now, I will not remember names, but it was very helpful for me. And in working with Lauren ahead of time, I knew the general degrees you all offer, but it's helpful to not only have an idea of the representation here, but also at least to it'll be testing my memory to remember what disciplines maybe are sitting where. But thank you. So today, we're going to go through a lot, and the good news is the top tier things are just overarching assessment information that I think are important to contextualize the work. It'll start to get a little beyond what you all are working with right now, but I think it's very important to know the process you're ultimately going through and to have that in mind as you're doing this work now. So we'll go through those pieces, and I'll pause for questions, and we have a lot of time for that. That was pretty intentional. And then we'll do a deeper dive into kind of where you are now with thinking about programs and curriculum mapping and learning outcomes. But we'll start high level, and like I said, there'll be time for questions, but feel free as I go, if you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll look at field there. I'm totally fine and flexible. I want this to be very much a conversation with you all and meaningful and understood by you all, because otherwise this really isn't all that relevant for me, because I know what I'm talking about. It's helpful for you all to understand. So if anything doesn't make sense, or if you need clarification, feel free to stop. So as we go, a few questions to help prime the pump here and get you all in the right mindset for assessment. Because assessment sometimes can elicit some certain connotations or expectations or conceptions, potential misunderstandings. So I want to set the stage by having you all think about the value of your area. And not saying value in the sense of like employment outcomes or value in terms of how many faculty you have or your salary or anything like that, but value in the sense of your work as a teacher, your work helping mold students and prepare them for their discipline, as well as specifically the things in your courses that you're trying to help students learn, and the value of those, the knowledge, skills, and behavior there. Also want you to think about how you communicate that. So you know what you know about your area, but do other people know that? Do your students know that? I'm working on an article right now talking about how commonly institutions fail at truly being student-centered from an articulated language perspective, right? Every institution will tell you they're student-centered, but if you pull up your policies, if you look at your course syllabi, if you look at your learning outcomes, a lot of times, if you would give that to a student, they wouldn't know what it is. How often do we hear from enrollment and financial aid, and advising that students don't understand what's going on. They don't understand the policies. They don't understand the degree requirements. Well, it's because we're writing it for us, not for them, right? And so that's not really student-centered. I don't want to go down that road too much, but just in general, thinking the value of your area, think about how you communicate that, and if you communicate that to other people, both internally with your colleagues, to students, externally to prospective students and families, externally to other colleagues, and then couldn't be talking about assessment without thinking, well, what data do you utilize? So thinking about that value, thinking of communicating about your area, how are you using data to inform that knowledge? Okay, so assessment, what it does for you, because, and this is very important, assessment should do things for you. It should not be something done to you or something that you feel you just have to do. It should be doing things for you and helping inform you, your work, and your students. So I want to just show these questions here, and I'll give you a moment to look them over. How do we know that students learn? What does achievement learning look like? How do we use multiple data sets to demonstrate student learning? What can we learn about student learning? These are very important questions that students might expect of us, that we might expect of ourselves. You know, if you're new, you might think about new faculty members coming into the institution. They might have these questions. And certainly our external accreditors will have these questions. Hopefully, you all would be interested in the answers to these questions as well. But the important thing is assessment answers all of these questions. Doing assessment work enables you to answer all of these questions and enables you to have a strategy around these. So I want to quick caveat say that I put some slides in here from our institution, not to say we're doing great work, because we certainly have our own struggles and things to do. It was just an easy example and an easy thing that I know where these things came from, so I can talk about the history of them or the justification for them. Whereas if I pulled them from maybe another institution, because a lot of great assessment institutional websites out there, I wouldn't necessarily know the story of how that came to be, whether it was an easy thing, whether it was a progression. So quick caveat there, so that not to say these are things you have to adopt or that I'm pushing these, but more just to say that I'm just out of ease using my own institution. So assessment should be, like I said, it should work for you. It should be meaningful to you. It should inform. You know, I always say, and we just wrapped up assessment reporting and are also wrapping up planning for this year. But when it comes to the reporting process, and I meet with the faculty and I meet with our staff, I kind of put their report aside and ask, so did this change anything? Regardless of whether you met your targets or whether you're concerned with the results or not, did this change? If you hadn't have gone through this process at all, would life be the same? You know, would teaching be the same? Would you have the same understanding of your program and other students? If they answer yes, like, you know, nothing changed, if I wouldn't have done this, everything would be fine, then I know something went terribly wrong. I know that either I messed up in helping guide them, or maybe they articulated the wrong learning outcomes, or maybe everything we put together we thought would work on paper and then it just fell apart, or maybe, you know, a key assessment in a course, the course didn't run, so they didn't collect the data they needed. But ultimately, it should be meaningful. It should also be manageable. Nobody should be, you know, breaking their backs to find out information that you all know, at least anecdotally, about how students are succeeding as well as where they're struggling. So assessment should be manageable. And I won't go through all these, but what I would say is we arrived at these 5 general principles based off of looking at literature, and there's a great document about the 9 principles of effective assessment work that was signed on by a number of titans in assessment research and practice that was published in the late 90s, early 2000s. And for us, this was something that we talked to our different programs, we talked to our faculty and staff, and everyone agreed to these things. And from the provost office and administration perspective, we wanted to make clear we believe in these things too, right? So we wanted to make sure faculty understood we are not trying to have you do things for the sake of doing them. We are not trying to add more work for the sake of adding more work. You know, we are trying to do these things. We are trying to help tease out the information you know about your students, the value of your areas, so that we can effectively communicate that to others, and so that we can be a lot more strategic and informed about the ways we are trying to improve as an institution, as well as that we can be appropriately allocating resources where they need to go, based off of data. So I've touched on this a little bit, but assessment should matter to you. This process should matter to you. You should make it matter to you. So the challenge that folks like Lauren and I have is we have to try and put together a framework or infrastructure that will accommodate everyone's needs, but is flexible, you know, that will both meet institution needs, but also be flexible enough for you all. But that relies on you all making it matter to you and speaking up and saying, well, this is how our program works. These are how our students are. These are the things we need to have present in this process, or the things we need to be able to include, or the story we need to tell. And then our job is to help make that possible and to help that fit within this general framework. But we can't do that if you all don't bring that information. So active engagement and bringing your subject matter expertise is so important to this process. And when done right, your voice should be heard, and you should be making this, it's this equal partnership of making this matter to you. But like I said, it also has to matter to the institution. I was grinning ear to ear when I heard that this is the most important initiative for this institution this year. I wish assessment was always touted that way at every institution, but that's incredible. And for you all here, I've heard some of the details of the structure and the arrangement, and the fact that you all are being compensated for your work, and there's a lot of intentional efforts and resources provided for this work is so important. And that should signal to you the institution cares about this and is dedicated to making sure you all feel supported to do this work, which isn't always the case. There are many institutions that do not have a person formally dedicated to assessment. That's not part of anybody's job. Anybody's job responsibility. Or there's often institutions with a single person with that responsibility, and faculty aren't given expectation or I'm sorry, they're expected to participate, but they're not given any type of load or release time to engage in this very important work. So one, Triton is certainly showing that they care, but also, as I was speaking about before, that's the challenge that the institution has is, as much as we want to give the freedom and flexibility of each program to do their own thing, there has to be a cohesive framework. There has to be a method to the madness when it comes to the work we're doing and being able to tell an institutional story. I know at our institution, we have 3 different colleges and then multiple disciplines within the colleges. And honestly, each college approaches assessment differently, but they all have some common elements in place of plans, reports, intentionality, targets. And so so we can tell this common, we can point to our values, we can point to then the common framework or skeleton, and then we can tell the unique story for each college and the unique resources that they might have, as well as the individual program story. But I think it's great that I don't have to sell this too much because Triton is demonstrating that this matters to them. But that's also a part of the process too that you all should be thinking of as well, as much as you're trying to make it matter to you and tell your story, thinking of how then you fit within the institutional story. That's important to keep in mind. If I've not compelled you enough, assessment matters to other entities as well. And I just included a word cloud here from all the different places in HLC's criteria and guiding values where it specifically calls out assessment. But I'm sure, hearing the different types of programs, you all might have programmatic accreditation, you also might have state requirements that also care about the outputs of student learning. So the reason why I put this sort of on the back end here of the intro context is because we should not be doing this for the sake of compliance. Compliance mindset is the worst mindset to have because that takes the focus of what we're supposed to be doing, right? If you approach teaching or working with your students from a minimal perspective of, well, what's the bare minimum I have to do here? That's not good. That's not effective teaching. That's not a good faculty member. Think of what you would tell your students if that's how they approached your class and said, what's the bare minimum I need to do to get through this? Okay, that's what I need to know, and that's all I'm going to do. I'm sure you would try and coach them to approach the topic a little differently. And the same thing here, and the secret, often, especially we've had some new hires at the institution, and I very quickly breeze through the fact that accreditation is part of my responsibility. Because I say, if everybody's doing their job and reflecting good practice in their work, about 98% of accreditation is taken care of. Because if everybody's doing what they should be, our accreditation standards are all about good practice and demonstrating that we have qualified faculty. Well, if HR is hiring appropriately based off of credentials, then we're great there, right? And if people are participating in doing assessment that matters to them and they're engaging in the process, then we're going to be fine with criteria 4. So I don't want to hit on this too hard, but I know it's a reality for you all, and I know it's something to pay attention to, which again is just added importance. And again, goes back to the thinking about how you communicate the work that you're doing, because you're going to have to communicate it in a cohesive story to the accreditors in 2020. Yeah. Okay. So engaging elements, these are just some of the core elements that I think are essential to assessment. And this actually, again, I talked about this a little bit for our institution, but these are the pieces that tie our institution together, even though practice is wildly different. So first, curriculum mapping. It's important to contextualize these things we call learning outcomes and where they come from, and parameters around what you can do and what you can't do with them. And so this is our framework. Again, I'm not showing this to you to say you have to adopt this exact model or anything, but for us, we have our university level learning outcomes, which align to our mission. And then all the academic programs at the undergraduate and graduate level, also their learning outcomes that they have align up to the university learning outcomes. And we also have a student affairs assessment going on, and the student learning outcomes that they have align up to the university learning outcomes. And then you have your course learning outcomes, right? So courses that are parts of programs or part of concentrations, obviously they are a standalone unit, right? Course learning outcomes matter to the course, and the materials that go into it, the assignments, all align. But courses are not an island. Courses belong to something else, whether it's a concentration, whether it's a program. And so it's important to contextualize and understand that, especially in a discipline where there's scaffolding of, like English 101 and an English 201 or English 102 or what have you. That second sequence course has to recognize the skills and knowledge that were intended in the first course and build off of that, or assume the students have that competency to move forward. And one way to do that is by knowing how your learning outcomes fit within a larger framework. And so I know we're going to be doing a lot of curriculum mapping and learning outcome talk later today, but it's increasingly important to keep this in mind. And one of the other cool byproducts around this is it can be context for, again, your program and how things fit within relationship between and of courses. Intentional planning. So, and I'm sorry, with curriculum mapping, one more piece, because this is a battle I'm fighting on my campus. Curriculum mapping is its own thing. It lives with curriculum. It lives with academic programs. It is not an assessment thing. That's a battle I'm fighting on my campus because some of my predecessors were some of the first people to push articulation of learning outcomes and having curriculum maps. And so it's ingrained in our college that curriculum maps are for assessment. They're not. They're for courses. They're for programs. They're for the curriculum. Now, you can use them for assessment, and you should look at how that fits. And again, because if we're telling our story of how students are learning and betterment, we need to know where the data is coming from, how that fits in the program, the different levels of learning. So it's useful in assessment, but it needs to be and should be its own thing. So it's an important point I would be remiss to leave out. But intentional planning, you don't have to measure everything all the time. Again, going back to this idea of manageable assessment, HLC and even other people, administrators, they do not expect you to be measuring every single thing all the time. One, that's not appropriate. Two, how are you going to divide your attention if you're measuring everything all the time? You're going to be overwhelmed. You're not going to know where to look and where to focus and how to dig a little deeper. So it's important to have a plan and to know if you're not measuring one thing this year, to not forget about it, but to think, okay, that's what we're going to focus on next year. And then know that too, even if you have a multi-year plan, that might change based off of the results, right? You might think, oh, we're doing really fine in this one area, so we're going to assess that this year, and assuming we'll be fine, we can then focus on this other piece next year. Well, your data might say you're not doing so fine. And so then you might have to roll that over into your next year's plan, but that's why you're at least making a plan to then be intentional in doing that follow-up. And in order to know how you're doing, you need to set some type of target, success criteria, expectations. Don't get hung up on the language, because sometimes I fight the faculty of, they'll say like, well, target implies this. I would call this a goal. Like, great, then call it a goal. I don't care what you call it, but we have to have some articulated element so that when you get your data, you know whether that data is cause for celebration or cause for concern. I'm working with our College of Education because unfortunately they are very much in a compliance mindset, and the state does not ask, the state and CAPE and their SPAs do not ask them to set criteria of expectations or success criteria. So all they have to do is report how students are doing. So they can report, students scored 80% of our students scored a 3 out of 4 on this rubric of this key, signature assignment. And that's good enough for the state. My question is, well, 80% sounds good, but what if last year you had 90%? Well, then 80% doesn't sound so good. Or what if last year you had, 70%? Well, then 80% is cause for celebration. But they're not, now they are looking at trends, but they're not setting a hard target or an expectation of, this is what we expect to see, whether we're above it for the year or below it for the year. This is what we're expecting to see. So it's very important to have some type of target. And, I get some pushback sometimes of, well, if we've never measured this or run this assessment before, how do I know? It's like, it's okay to make a hypothesis and guess. You know in your gut that if I handed you data on a new assessment, what you'd be happy with, what you'd be okay with, and what you'd be very concerned with. So use that information, and then once you get your data, you can update your target. Just like plans and assessment, it's an iterative process. And then reporting. Now I include this little graphic here because this is my definition of reporting, and from from literature field and the assessment as well as accreditation, I'm blending a bit of reporting with some other aspects, but your report needs to tell a story, and it needs to include plans for action, right? So I include in our assessment template, like, what'd you do, what'd you find, what does it mean, and what are you going to do about it? Because that is a report. A report is not a spreadsheet. A report is not a graph. So tell a story. Now, because we don't want you all writing books in your free time, it doesn't need to be long. The assessment templates that we have are just like, it's a one-page template, and then when faculty fill it out, it ends up being maybe 2 pages. So It doesn't have to be a long story, but it needs to be a story, and it needs to have multiple elements to it. And taking action. This is one of the most critical things of the whole process. Unfortunately, it's one of the most neglected parts of the process because so many people do the work, go through the cycle, write their report, and then breathe a sigh of relief. Work is done. We met our deadline. Now we can take a break until we have to write our plan or until the next academic year. No, the work is arguably just starting because, again, hopefully something happened in the process and you learned something about your students. Even if you met all your targets, the one action I always implore people is share it. Tell people. Tell your internal colleagues, hey, look, we just met all our targets. Tell your students, the people that we're collecting all this data from. How often are you telling students about the great things that they're doing or that you're doing in your program? How often are you telling them about the improvements you're making in your program based off of data, the curriculum updates, the new faculty that you have? Students care about that stuff. Now, you might have to tell it to them in a way that attracts their attention, holds their attention, but they care about that information. And we should be telling them about that. Now, it's very rare for everyone to be meeting all their expectations and not have anything to improve on, and so their only action is telling their story. So where you need to dive a little deeper, where you need to address not meeting certain targets, that's some action you need to take. And you don't have to have all the answers. You know, I often tell people in their reports, it can be good enough in your report to say, I'm going to call a meeting with, you know, our dean or with the other faculty to talk more about what this means, right? Or we're seeing this problem in the third course of this sequence. We don't really know if the problem's in this course or if it was in an earlier course that they didn't get the preparation to demonstrate the learning in this course. And so it's fine to say, we need to sit and talk more about this and figure out, you know, a specific plan. You don't have to come up with that plan while you're writing your report. But it's important then to actually do something about the data. And that's one of the big things that a lot of institutions, given the culture of assessment and how the field is moving, a lot of people are doing kind of assessment 1.0, which is they're doing assessment and they have reports, but they're not taking action. Or they can't provide the evidence that they are taking the action. And so they're still being noted from HLC and from others of you're not doing enough. Which in reality, they're probably doing some of the work, it just might be a documentation issue. But key point, you are not done when you do your report. And so this just, to piece together the elements I ran through, you know, using curriculum maps, thinking about plans, setting targets, and doing reporting, it's a very connected process, right? Because if you find that you need to take action in a certain course, maybe change an assignment, well, that might impact the learning outcomes. That might impact the course sequence piece, and so it might impact your curriculum map. Or it might impact your plan for the next year, because you need to reassess that. Or maybe you don't need to reassess it, so you can add in one of those other measures that you haven't looked at. But there's an intricate connection between each of these pieces, which is why I wanted to run through some of this stuff, because I know today and where you all are right now is you're really just focusing on learning outcomes, but it's helpful and important to know how the work you're doing now is going to impact these other pieces. You know, I just was working with a group yesterday who wrote their learning outcome in a way that then when we were trying to develop a measure for it, they're like, well, we want to measure this, and this is ultimately the data point we need to know. I said, well, that's different from what your learning outcome was. So, you know, are you trying, like, I know you maybe want to have this data point that sounds great, but is that really what you're trying to teach them? Is that what your intervention is helping them learn? Because that's what we need to know, and that's what we need to measure. And so they're like, oh, yeah, I guess we have to go back and look at our learning outcome and potentially rework it a little bit. Not completely change it, but phrase it differently to better match what they really want to measure. Challenging challenges. So, again, like I said, in this process, you can go through it and say, yeah, I didn't learn anything, or I don't see any reason to change our program. And if that's the case, likely something went wrong. So I don't want to belabor this point because I talked about it earlier, but for me, it's never a matter of assigning blame or dwelling too much on the fact that it didn't happen, but it's important to acknowledge that, yeah, this really didn't help. And so what can we do to make it more meaningful, make it matter in the future? Again, you might also think, well, we did this and I learned something, but this doesn't matter to me. These aren't the questions that keep me up at night. These aren't the things that I care most about with my students. Well, again, if that's the case, then change needs to happen. Maybe you didn't articulate the right learning outcomes. Maybe we're not measuring the right thing, but it should be meaningful. And from our perspective, from an assessment professional's perspective, we can't read your mind. We're not the subject matter experts in your discipline. So we don't know if, as we're working with you to refine and articulate learning outcomes, if those are the most important things to your discipline. And so that's where, again, it's so important for you to come with the mindset of, this is what our students need to know, this is what we expect of our students, and that we've built our curriculum off of. And then we'll work together, and sometimes even when you're all on the same page, it cannot work out, and that's okay. You then think about the pieces to change and improve for next time. You might say it's not related to your goals. Faculty members sometimes say, hey, I got into this game to teach students, not to write reports. Or I'm here to help students do this specific thing. That's my job. Yeah, well, if that is your job, we need to know that you're doing it. And not from a performance perspective, because that's another big barrier to assessment is sometimes people are afraid to engage in it because they worry that it's going to reflect on their performance or it's going to call out specific faculty. Assessment is centered on student learning. You could be the best instructor in the world, but if there's a disconnect between what you're teaching and their perspective, it doesn't matter. It's just like me, like I said, I'm pretty good at what I do given my case record with other institutions, but I could not be speaking the right way to you all. And if you're not getting what I'm saying, even though I've had great institutional success and do this often, it just might not be landing with you all. And if I don't know that, then I don't know how to make it better for you all. So even though your goal may not have been to be writing assessment reports and to be engaging with this work, it should be part of your goal. Because again, if you're making it meaningful with your outcomes, if you're making it meaningful with data you need to know, then it should be aligning with your goals. Because if you know how your students are learning and all you care about is teaching, well, then you know your students are learning, and so you can pat yourself on the back for being a good teacher. Or if you know your students aren't learning, then you can dig into why. And again, it might not be your teaching style. It might be the curriculum. It might be something completely outside of your control. It might be that you realize your students have financial difficulties or time constraints because they're working multiple jobs, and so they can't focus and pay attention to your curriculum. And that's something outside of your control, but if you know that, then you can try and work with the institution to address those things. So you may say that you don't have the experience. You're in your discipline, you've not been trained on assessment, you don't know what any of this is. Or again, like I said before, you might be pushing the notion of, well, I'm an arts person, I don't think in numbers. Assessment's for everyone, and you all have experience in this room. You're hearing the disciplines and knowing the disciplines. Some of you all are highly regulated. Some of your disciplines are highly, highly regulated by external accreditors, the state, other entities. So you all are doing some form of evaluation, whether it's assessment or not, you're doing some of this work. So you have some people in this room who have written reports, who are familiar with this work, who maybe even are doing great things and are assessment champions. Leverage that, talk to them, ask them what it's like, ask them, how they got to where they are, because they maybe you got into this not knowing that, and wanting to teach and realizing that they have these external requirements. So leverage those uses. You also have assessment staff available to you, people who have part of their job dedicated to being supports. And then even if you think you're tapped out internally, you have external colleagues. There are, well, I know some disciplines have listservs and professional organizations, but there are multiple assessment and evaluation listservs, organizations that promote free information, free resources. I mentioned I'm a coach for NILOA. NILOA's website gives away just so many toolkits and institutional examples and case studies. And then as a coach with NILOA, if you work through them, they'll send coaches to your campus for free. So there are so many free opportunities, resources, and professionals willing and able and wanting to help you do assessment work. So saying you don't have the experience is not enough of a barrier, because you have some internal colleagues that you can reach out to, and you also have external resources freely available to you. So again, if this isn't important to the institution, and if you're making it important to your program, experience level should not be a barrier. It just might be something you need to address as you're looking to go into this work. And so again, the limited resources piece, you can combat this a bit. We all are busy. We all have many constraints on our time, both personally and professionally. And so again, this goes back to a bit of the planning of being intentional in this work. We ask in our assessment plans, we have people talk about when they're going to do their reporting. Building in, just tell us, yep, like first 2 weeks of June, that's when we're going to work on doing our report. If you don't think about that now, the year flies by. And then next thing you know, you're prepping for next year, and oh yeah, I got to do that assessment report. And maybe, and that's when the colleges sometimes will go, oh, well, not a lot of faculty are around in the summer. It's like, well, then maybe let's not have the reports due when they're not around. Or, we do have a lot of faculty summer contracts. Like, how about we be more intentional in assigning those and make sure that if summer is when reports need to be due, that you have the faculty around to do them. But again, in making it meaningful and matter to you, those are the things for you to think about of being intentional and knowing, when am I going to do this work? Knowing that you have limited time, and being intentional. If you know that you're low on the experience level, building in time that, okay, so well, I need to talk to these people to get a little more experience, or I need to dedicate time to review these resources before I get into my plan, before I get into pulling the data, so that you're setting yourself up for that future success. And I'm really excited. Assessment has a bit of a quick learning curve, because once you go through a cycle or two, you get it. And then that's when you can dig a little deeper to better understand your students and make it even more meaningful to you all. But you got to get over that first hump. And I know it can be a lot of time, attention to get into the space, but then it just so easily folds into and integrates with the work you're already doing when you're ready. Woo! So, thoughts, comments, questions. Again, this was just this high-level overview of assessment as work, as a cycle, elements and considerations for it. Some of it goes well beyond kind of where you all are, so I am totally fine if you're all like, listen, we're at program learning outcomes, we'll worry about reporting later. But I think it's important to set that up so that those are things you will be doing and pieces you will be tackling, and to get that information to you all up front.
Any questions right now for Joe?
Could you explain what NILOA is?
Yeah, so NILOA is the National Institute for Learning Outcomes Assessment. It's a professional organization. It's a nonprofit that actually is housed out of University of Illinois. But they have people, like they have NILOA coaches that are from all over, and their whole thing is about promoting learning outcomes assessment. So they have a newsletter. They regularly point out institutions that have really great assessment websites. They put out case studies of institutions that had a great success story with doing something assessment related. They provide resources so that if you want to dig into certain topics. If you want to see other institutions that have struggled with putting together learning outcomes, you can go on their site and look for that information. You can also see they put out what they call their occasional papers, and their thought papers or articles around different topics. One that really picked up a lot of steam last year was they did one on equity in assessment and equity in education and how assessment can bring help with that conversation. And that garnered then 12 different response articles from different professionals in the field. And their most recent occasional paper was on identifying technology for assessment work and how to leverage existing technology using free resources and also considerations for paid software. But they cover it all in terms of providing assessment support, and that's the whole purpose of their organization, is to elevate and celebrate assessment work happening, because we know it has to happen, but they're trying to promote it, look at all the good things that can come about from this work and how it can enrich both faculty, staff, as well as ultimately students. They even have a couple books that they've published, and they annually do a survey of academic provosts about the state of assessment, and so they usually put out papers and presentations about that as well. Yeah.
I have a question regarding curriculum mapping. When you look at curriculum mapping, however, it is really, in my understanding, involved with looking at concepts and your learning outcomes, where they are met within your curriculum. So I'm kind of confused as to, is truly a curriculum map in its own space? Because my understanding is your learning objectives and your concept have to be demonstrated on that curriculum map.
Yeah, and all I meant by curriculum maps being in their own space is that they're not an element of assessment.
Okay.
They have value and purpose well beyond assessment. But yeah, and maybe it's again me projecting my institution, but I've been with a couple institutions where when you talk about curriculum mapping in the context of assessment, if they don't have them, they think it's only something you have to do for assessment, just like an assessment report. And so they think, oh, curriculum mapping, that's an assessment thing. It's like, no. Curriculum mapping is a curriculum thing. We just borrow some of that information to inform assessment.
Because like in nursing, when we have our learning objectives and concepts, we have to curriculum map all that out. So in reality, for us, they are entwined together.
Yeah, I often say curriculum maps are like the blueprint for an academic program.
Yes.
There's another hand.
That's right, but it was the same question. The main objective today is for us to get the learning outcomes into the curriculum, right? And that was the same question, and trying to understand why is it that you believe in that these learning outcomes should live only in the curriculum space.
Yeah, and we'll get into the deep dive in the learning outcomes. I have a lot more. I get into curriculum mapping a lot more when we talk about learning outcomes, so don't worry. I'll unpack that.
Any last questions before we take our break? Yeah.
Things that resonated with me about data collection and data use, because it's certainly a hot topic in all industries right now. We can see it from hubs, like POS being very data driven. And but when you collect that data, the thing that I wanted to ask was, you mentioned about you're assessing where the problem is, and data should be actionable, which is another concept, key concept right now. Can you give me a little bit of insight into, as you select some assessments, because I tend to be very hard on myself. I take it that it's all my fault, right? How do you discern, between where the problem is and what the action is? And I don't expect a whole lot of you to know, but you can just give me some broad strokes about that discernment where the issue is.
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes into the reflection of the data. So hang on, I'll kind of put a couple things together that might help paint a picture of this. Just working with our prior learning assessment falls under my area as well, and we have this portfolio opportunity. So if the student wants to demonstrate, if they want to demonstrate they have, say, experience with communication, they can take this portfolio class and demonstrate through an essay that they have communication skills, and maybe they can then get credit that then they won't have to take like an English class. But because we do that in this like course shell, it's set up like a course, even though the students just kind of working with a faculty member, putting together this essay, and that's it. That course had been getting the usual course evaluation, which is just a long instrument that we push out to all courses. And the faculty member, our PLA director said, we get that, and there's like 2 questions on there that really help us, but there's a lot of information that doesn't apply because this isn't a traditional course. I said, great, so let's stop doing that course evaluation. And if there's only 2 questions that you care about from it, you might have a couple other questions. So we ended up developing our own course evaluation for that portfolio class. That's only, I think, 7 questions, but it's all questions that PLA director needs to know. And then they take, and when we were writing those questions, I asked them, okay, so you said you wanted to talk about, satisfaction of faculty. I said, well, what does that mean, and what are you going to do with that data? If a student says they're dissatisfied with a faculty member, what does that tell you? Nothing, other than the student was dissatisfied in some way. We don't know if that was the way, the timeliness of the faculty member's responses. We don't know if it was the way the faculty member interacted with the student, the way they ran the course. All we know is the student was dissatisfied. So I said, let's ask more specific questions that will inform and give you something to act on, other than going to the faculty member and saying, well, you had some dissatisfied students. Do you know why they might be dissatisfied? Because to your point, well, then the faculty member, well, I messed this up, or I did this, I did that, because they're so hard on themselves. But in reality, it might have just been the student, this faculty member didn't answer one of their emails. It has nothing to do with the course content, nothing to do with these other things. But the other piece is, another example about diagnosing the problem is sometimes you don't know. You might be measuring an end of program or a later sequence course and find that students aren't demonstrating the learning they should be on that assignment. And to be honest, you really don't know if that's because their learning trajectory was appropriate up until that course and then they just kind of fell down there, or if along the way they took a dip or they missed a concept, squeaked by in one course, but then this assignment in this later course is building off of that. Because they didn't learn it here, they're not demonstrating it well here. And you really don't know that just based on getting the data here. And so that's where you're not gonna have all the answers, but that's where, like I said, your action plan could be, well, we're gonna talk to the faculty that teach all these courses. And that's where ultimately the hope, not to scare you all and thinking that there's going to be even more work, but the hope is that eventually you have these these points of measurement throughout a student's experience, so that then you can always bring the data to the table, and it could be just a quick check of, well, we know this assignment builds off of this assignment in this other course. How are students performing there? Oh, they're great. Okay, so then the problem is in this course. Versus, oh no, students are struggling there too, so we can give this course a break because it's not necessarily the problem here. Let's try and focus here, since this is a scaffolded curriculum, and make sure that learning's happening here as it should be, and then let's reassess over here after we make the change earlier. But again, when you're just getting the data here, you don't quite know. And so you don't always have the, and that's okay. That's the thing I was talking about with the action plan, is you don't have to be perfect and know every single thing. But that's why you do need to be intentional in the data you're collecting and have realistic expectations of, well, we hope this is going to tell us what we need to know here. And sometimes, just as a starting point, you have to get some kind of baseline of, when the student walks out the door, these are the things we hope they get. And if they're not getting those, well, then that starts our discovery of why not.
Great. I just want to make sure there's going to be plenty of time to ask questions. So I just want to make sure we can take our break, and then we're going to come back for kind of that deep dive. So if you all want to grab some coffee, grab some food, go to the restroom, and we'll head back in our seats at 10:05. We'll kick off with the deep dive into the program we're doing.